Hello, Com 3083. My name is Kyle Kirshner, and today we'll be talking about situational crisis communication theory. This theory was first published in 2007 in the journal Corporate Reputation Review and serves as a guide for how to protect organizational reputations during a crisis. To aid our discussion of this theory, we'll be looking at the recent February 2021 power outages that swept across Texas. We will examine some of the critical points of situational crisis communication theory, and then we'll follow up with how this theory aligns with the communication that was occurring during and after the power crisis. We will review some final summary points, and then we'll look at the resources that built up this theory. In mid-February 2021, a series of severe winter storms swept across the United States due to a jet stream dipping particularly far into the southern U.S. This jet stream initially stretched from Washington to Texas and then moved back north along the East Coast, which allowed a polar vortex to bring frigid air across the entire country. This rush of cold air spawned multiple storms along the jet stream track. This weather phenomenon resulted in record low temperatures throughout Texas, with temperatures in Dallas, Austin, Houston, and San Antonio falling below temperatures in Anchorage, Alaska. As wind turbines froze up, renewable energy sources were initially blamed for the lack of energy output, but it was later discovered that natural gas power plants either freezing up or having mechanical failures contributed to an even greater lack of energy output. When the decision was made to selectively cut off power lines to maintain the entire energy grid, compressors that pushed natural gas through pipelines were also knocked offline, further adding to the lack of energy supply. Due to the surge in energy demand and the substantial shortfall in energy generation, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT, began implementing rotating blackouts. It was argued that these blackouts prevented electricity demand from overwhelming the grid, which would have caused equipment to catch fire and power lines to go down, potentially leading to a much more severe blackout event. At its peak, over 5 million people in Texas were without power, some for more than 3 days. On February 16th, Governor Greg Abbott declared that ERCOT reform would be an emergency priority for the state legislature and that there would be an investigation of the power outage to determine long-term solutions. A 357-page report had been written after the 2011 power outages in Texas, which seemed to have been ignored, as many critical generators still lacked appropriate weatherization in 2021. ERCOT was ultimately held responsible for the lack of preparation. 5 unaffiliated members of ERCOT resigned due to the power failures, and the ERCOT board of directors also voted to fire its CEO, Bill Magnus, who turned down his $800,000 severance package. As the story evolved, ERCOT attempted to maintain a reliable reputation during and after the event, but it was heavily scrutinized. Now let's take a look at situational crisis communication theory. Situational crisis communication theory, or SCCT, offers a framework for understanding the dynamics of crisis communication and provides a mechanism for anticipating how stakeholders will react to a crisis in terms of the reputational threat posed by a crisis. From its empirical research, a set of evidence-based crisis communication guidelines have been formed. SCCT is an extension of attribution theory, which posits that people search for the causes of events, making attributions, especially for events that are negative and unexpected. A person attributes responsibility for an event and will experience an emotional reaction to the event. If the organization is deemed responsible, the reputation suffers and the stakeholders become angry. Stakeholders may then sever connections to the organization or create negative word of mouth. Management, therefore, has a vested interest in preventing these types of outcomes. Ethically, the first priority in any crisis is to protect the stakeholders from harm, not to protect the reputation. Instructing information tells stakeholders what they must do to protect themselves from the physical threat of a crisis. Instructing information can be delivered directly to stakeholders through some type of alarm or warning, or through the news media. Adapting information helps people to cope with the psychological threat of a crisis. The uncertainty of a crisis produces stress for stakeholders, which creates a need for information. To cope with the psychological stress, stakeholders need information about what happened and what is being done to protect them from similar crises in the future. What corrective actions are being taken? By using communication to address the physical and psychological concerns of victims, crisis managers can then move on to other concerns, such as maintaining reputational assets. SCCT provides guidance for when crisis managers have met their initial obligations and are then prepared to address reputational assets. Finally, SCCT provides a base to predict the reputational threat presented by a particular crisis, and then also prescribes crisis response strategies designed to protect reputational assets. SCCT protects against reputational threats by considering 3 factors in a 2-step process. Research has highlighted that initial crisis responsibility, crisis history, and prior relational reputation shape the reputational event. Initial crisis responsibility is based on what attribution stakeholders make about the personal control the organization had over the crisis. Said another way, whether stakeholders believe organizational actions caused the crisis or not. The initial crisis assessment is based on what is known as a crisis type. The crisis type can vary based on how the crisis is being framed. There are a lot of theories relating to political and mass media communications, but the short excerpt that we need is that the way a message is framed shapes how people define a problem, explain the cause of a problem, attribute responsibility for the problem, and how they find solutions to the problem. How mass media chooses to frame issues affects political judgments because frames can stress certain facts or values, making them more or less salient when individuals make decisions. There are 3 crisis types, ascending in reputational threat: the victim cluster, the accidental cluster, and the preventable cluster. Most simply, whether the organization is a victim of a crisis, took actions leading to an unintentional accident, or whether the organization took inappropriate actions or knowingly placed people at risk. After the first step of assessing the initial responsibility for the crisis, the second step is to look at intensifying factors. If there's a history of crises or a bad prior relationship, the reputational damage will be intensified. Once the total responsibility has been accounted for, the organization needs to respond to show accountability. While a perfect list of response strategies cannot be crafted for all situations, an escalating set of responses show increasing levels of accepting responsibility for a crisis. Previous research has found that the primary SCCT crisis response strategies form 3 groups based upon the perceptions of accepting responsibility for a crisis: deny, diminish, and rebuild. Deny strategies attempt to remove any connection between the organization and the crisis. If the organization is not involved in a crisis, it will not suffer any damage from the event. In rumor and challenge crises, managers need to argue that there is no real crisis. If stakeholders, including the news media, accept that the no crisis frame of denial, then the organization is spared any reputational harm. The diminished crisis response strategies argue that a crisis is not as bad as people think, or that the organization lacked control over the crisis. If crisis managers lessen an organization's connection to the crisis or have people view the crisis less negatively, then the harmful effects of the crisis are reduced. Rebuild strategies are the main avenue for generating new reputational assets. These strategies attempt to improve the organization's reputation by offering material or symbolic forms of aid to victims. Crisis managers say and do things to benefit stakeholders and thereby take positive actions to offset the crisis. Rebuild strategies are used for crises that present a severe reputational threat, such as intentional crises or accidental crises coupled with a crisis history or bad relational reputation. There are a couple of caveats that stand out about SCCT. As mentioned before, SCCT is built off of attribution theory, but it also includes several interrelated evidence-based propositions that are used to support the framework. Based on the previous overview, most of these propositions are fairly straightforward. A history of crises intensifies a current crisis situation. A bad prior relationship with the organization will intensify a crisis. Responsibility for a crisis will cause emotions and affect stakeholders physically and psychologically. The reputation of the organization changes the behavior stakeholders take towards the organization, and the emotional affect of the stakeholders will make them not support or even enjoy harm to the organization. Of all these propositions, only the affect behavioral intention proposition shows limited empirical support. All the others can be empirically substantiated. Finally, it might be easy to say an organization should always go with a full apology and use rebuild strategies anytime a crisis occurs. Unfortunately, this is simply not the case. First, the more accommodating the strategy, the more expensive it is for the organization. While that isn't reason enough to shy away from a full apology every time, it is also true that overly accommodating strategies do not produce produce a better reputational benefit than simply meeting the needs as prescribed by SCCT. In fact, overly accommodating strategies used unnecessarily can actually worsen the reputational situation because stakeholders can come to believe that the crisis must be worse than what they previously thought if an organization responds too aggressively. It's a careful balancing act. Let's look at what happened with ERCOT and the February outages. While our theory is rather straightforward, our events in reality unfold over time. Because of this, I think it's important to notice how things adjusted over time. However, there were final outcomes from the event, so I think it's also important to apply our theory to the final outcome. The first notion of SCCT is ethics. Take care of the stakeholders first. In this case, there were advanced weather warnings from news media, the governor issued a disaster declaration 2 days into the first storm, and ERCOT issued energy conservation notices 4 days into the storm, when power demand reached an all-time winter high. Notices were also sent before ERCOT began implementing rotating outages. In this regard, it appears all parties, including ERCOT, provided notice and took appropriate and necessary actions to safeguard stakeholders. On day 6 of the storms, Governor Abbott declared there would be an investigation into ERCOT and emergency reform in the next legislative session. Step 1 of SCCT is to assess the initial responsibility. As events progressed, the frame of victimizing unruly winter storm changed almost immediately into a preventable oversight due to not weatherizing generators when officials were previously warned 10 years earlier. There was a small window where additional outages were caused due to the rotating outage decision, so I believe it was briefly framed as accidental, but the final outcome remains that the energy crisis had at least 10 years of warning with no appropriate action to prevent it. Step 2 of SCCT is to look at intensifying factors. As I just mentioned, a 357-page report came out after the 2011 outage that was very similar, describing that such an event was likely should severe winter weather patterns emerge. While it appears this weather may only occur once every 10 years, officials were warned and did not take preventative measures. Overall, I believe most people knew little to nothing about ERCOT before this outage, so while they had a fairly neutral reputation, they did have a crisis history. Finally, we form a response strategy. Only 6 days into the storms, Governor Abbott declared there would be an investigation and emergency reform. While this effectively took the ball out of ERCOT's court, this ensured that a rebuild strategy would be coming down the road. Ultimately, 5 ERCOT board members resigned and the CEO was fired. Other changes have taken place in the Public Utility Council and Texas legislature to hopefully prevent another similar disaster for several years to come. So what can be taken away from this discussion? While the process was an unfolding matter, the final outcome was predicted by SCCT. After an investigation that showed a preventable crisis type with an additional crisis history, reform and rebuild strategies were exercised to restore the reputational assets of ERCOT and the Texas power grid. It's important to note that ERCOT isn't the only organization in the story, but that they were chiefly held responsible. The Texas state government and Texas's Public Utility Council also faced similar reform and rebuild strategies to maintain their reputations. An evolving part of these events was the way the story and the outages were framed. Had the initial victim of winter storms story stayed that way, these organizations may not have been held accountable. However, the event was severe and the stakeholders were demanding answers. Finally, while Texas has instituted new legislations and ERCOT and the Texas Public Utility Council have new board members, these organizations are now in the public's eye. They have a crisis history, and future failures will be handled in a less friendly manner. The primary resource of SCCT is the Situational Crisis Communication Theory itself, which appeared in the 2007 Corporate Reputation Review. As SCCT is based off of attribution theory, some material was also gleaned from Werner's 1986 and 2006 articles. I hope you were able to learn something valuable from situational crisis communication theory. Thank you for your time, and put it to good use the next time you find yourself in a sticky situation.